Thank you. Next item of business is a debate on motion 22033 in the name of Kate Forbes on fiscal implications of COVID-19. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Kate Forbes to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, 12 minutes or thereabout, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. COVID-19 has presented Scotland, like much of the world, with a twin economic and health crisis. It's demanded a fiscal response that would have been unimaginable a few months ago. And with that in mind, it's important that we debate both the fiscal response to date and the actions that are still required as we move to the next phase of our response. And let me be very clear. Just as we have devoted our full and collective efforts, energy and creativity to the health emergency and to saving lives, so we will deploy all of our resources and ingenuity to the economic crisis and saving livelihoods. Since the beginning, with the support of parties across the Chamber and informed by stakeholders, we've taken a series of urgent actions, all with significant fiscal implications in response to the challenges faced by individuals, communities and businesses the length and breadth of this country. In light of the pace and the scale of these actions, fiscal transparency is vital, building a shared understanding of our opportunities but also our constraints. And accordingly, I have brought an early update to Parliament through a summer budget revision which the Finance and Constitution Committee has been considering. And it's become even clearer that the fiscal framework was not designed with a pandemic or an economic emergency in mind. It's not fit for the purpose of flexible budget management in these present circumstances, and that matters because it will make the difference between investing in our communities, our economy and our public services or not. And I'm pleased to see cross-party recognition from Labour, the Lib Dems and the Greens of the need for additional flexibilities and powers. Presiding Officer, the estimated Barnett consequentials notified by Treasury currently stand at £3.791 billion, and we are directing all such funding to our COVID-19 response. However, I would highlight the risk that these sums are subject to change, very possibly revised downwards, as they were by £70 million a few weeks ago. I am liaising closely with Treasury and continuing to press for assurances that funding won't be clawed back. Let me recap on our key spending actions to date. All additional funding so far in respect of health and social care has been passed on directly. That currently stands at around £780 million, with more anticipated in respect of PPE and test and protect costs. We've committed over £2.3 billion of business support measures targeted to reflect the differences between Scotland's economy and recovery and the rest of the UK. We've established sectoral schemes such as the 100% rates relief for tourism, retail and hospitality businesses and focused assistance for groups such as fishermen, the self-employed and small B&Bs. In fact, some of those groups that were highlighted over the weekend by the media and the UK Treasury Select Committee as falling through the Chancellor's schemes are caught by our extra funding. We've ensured that our response is nimble. Where demand has been lower than anticipated, we've repurposed funding. The prime example being the £120 million Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund that is supporting companies considered vital to the local or the national economy. Our £350 million community support package is making sure that those most affected by the pandemic get the help they need, particularly around emergency food. That funding supports low-income families with children, disabled people, older people, those who are self-isolating and others at risk. It's also helped support the third sector, which is doing a brilliant job in very challenging circumstances. We've committed over £300 million of direct support for local authorities, including some of the communities package. We're in regular contact with COSLA and individual councils about funding and other operational issues reflecting their importance. Well, I've been clear that the UK government funding to date is welcome, not least because it's our only source of extra funding during a pandemic, because we are not as yet permitted extra powers or flexibilities. It falls short of what's needed, and the fiscal framework, agreed in good faith, is too limited for us to address that gap. So together with Wales and Northern Ireland, I am continuing to engage with the UK Government to press for fiscal flexibility, and today's motion seeks support for that principle. With the summer budget revision, my main intention has been to support early parliamentary consideration given the scale and the pace of our fiscal response. It seeks to amend the Budget Act by allocating over 3.5 billion in COVID-19 response funding notified by Treasury, £112 million of other consequentials generated by the UK budget, and a further £255 million reprioritised from existing allocations. It's a snapshot position from mid-May, and we intend to bring forward autumn and spring budget revisions during the financial year in the usual way. What the summer budget revision doesn't capture is the extent to which the costs we're now facing across all levels of government exceed the very welcome funding we have received to date. Based on notified consequentials, we currently estimate a shortfall of hundreds of millions of pounds. And that risk, which has now come to pass, was highlighted in March by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And that's based on budget committed across portfolios to date, together with our central estimate of additional health and social care spend this year, excluding PPE and Test and Protect, which are subject to separate funding discussions with UK Government just now. And that's before any further portfolio pressures that we anticipate to support ongoing containment, reopening and recovery this year. And I make this point with the aim of being open about the ongoing challenge and the context for any further UK funding. The recovery from the COVID-19 outbreak will require significant further funding. For example, our transport system will need to adapt to the continuing constraints of distancing as the economy reopens. The education system, from childcare to universities, will require new ways of working as children, pupils and students return. And our social security system will need to assist those affected by loss of income, while our employability and skills support will need to adapt to meet the challenge of growing unemployment. And without additional funding or flexibilities, we will face the impossible choice of not funding those areas and thus harming the economy and recovery, or making deep cuts to other areas of expenditure, which will similarly undermine recovery. And without certainty over funding, we are planning for recovery with one hand tied behind our back. But let me be clear, the funding provided to date is most welcome, but we will not be clear on what is available through the Barnett formula until the UK Government has finalised its own funding decisions. That might be too late for the decisions that we need to take now. Presiding Officer, I want to significantly invest in our economy, restore confidence and support Scottish businesses to create jobs and protect livelihoods. We will do what we can, but I want to be straight with the nation. As long as we are denied the ability to borrow for these purposes or use our budget as efficiently as possible or get full guarantees on funding available, the risk, the uncertainty and the volatility undermines our best efforts. It's not just the Scottish Government making these arguments. People of other political persuasions, and none, are making them too. I already quoted the Institute for Fiscal Studies, but they wrote, and I quote, "There is therefore a case for giving the devolved governments greater access to borrowing." Another man I don't often quote, but the former Chancellor, Alistair Darling, said that Scotland should benefit from low-cost borrowing. And the Fraser Allender Institute said that the flexibilities within the fiscal framework are not sufficient to bear the risk of the pandemic. Presiding Officer, this underlines the case for reasonable additional powers and flexibilities in respect of the fiscal framework, alongside the case for assurances from the UK Government on estimated COVID-19 funding. This is not a technical debate about fiscal flexibilities, and it's not a proxy debate for the Constitution. It is an appeal. It's an appeal for common sense and cross-party recognition that movement on these matters will enable us to invest and reject austerity. And a failure to make progress will prove unthinkable for our communities, our economy and our public services. In the meantime, Presiding Officer, whilst we debate these matters, we are still working as quickly as we did at the beginning of the pandemic to support the economy. On Friday, Fiona Hislop announced our investment in oil and gas. We've published guidance and offered certainty. We are committed to investing. The lockdown has impacted on capital investment plans across different parts of the Scottish Government, with the result that planned expenditure has been slowed or paused within some portfolios. The Scottish Government has a significant programme of infrastructure and capital investment planned, with a £6.2 billion included in the budget for 2020-2021. However, in some cases, paused or delayed activity has meant that portfolios now anticipate underspends. And on that basis, I'm pleased to announce a 2020-21 return to work package comprising £230 million of reallocated capital and financial transaction investment to be deployed across a range of activity that accelerates digital transformation and supports the most vulnerable groups to access digital services, that brings forward an early boost to our ambition for a green economy and bolsters the remaining pipeline of 2020-21 construction activity to give additional support to the sector when restart gets underway. COVID-19 has emphasised that digitally enabled public services are not only possible but necessary, and this package will build on the considerable progress made in moving services online through further investment in digital transformation. And altogether, the package provides approximately £87 million of a range of investments to bolster the pipeline of 2020-21 construction activity, which we estimate will support around 700 jobs in the wider Scottish economy, including through a range of place-based regeneration schemes. It also brings forward investment in multiple schemes aimed at supporting the transition to net zero. It delivers investment right across Scotland, in every part of Scotland. And this is only phase one of our economic response as people go back to work. Larger programmes will follow. And so, Presiding Officer, as I come to a close, I will of course continue to press for additional funding, and whilst views on the detail may vary, I hope that members across the Chamber can agree in principle that further fiscal flexibility will only enhance our collective response to this pandemic, enabling us to invest and reject austerity. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you please move? I don't think you moved the motion. Perhaps
and
I
I
missed it at the beginning.
move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. And now call Donald Cameron to speak to and move Amendment 22033.1. Mr Cameron, about 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to open for the Scottish Conservatives today. And can I move the amendment in my name? It is undoubtedly the case that the pandemic has presented us with significant challenges, whether it be managing public health in the safest way possible, protecting our economy from the immediate shocks of closure, or ensuring that our children continue to receive the best education they can in the circumstances. And the financial support offered to Scotland's workers and businesses has been paramount in sustaining livelihoods, and I genuinely believe that for the most part, both of Scotland's governments have responded quickly and effectively. The UK government in particular has stepped up by injecting significant financial resources into the Scottish economy, and while I mentioned some of these a few weeks ago, they bear repeating in order to acknowledge the sheer enormity of that response, which is without doubt unprecedented. During a crisis as significant as this one, the United Kingdom is Scotland's insurance policy, and it has paid out in full and on time. 3.8 billion, no thank you, 3.8 billion of Barnett consequentials, which have been vital to support our public services, 4.8 billion of support through the job retention scheme, nearly 700 million for our self-employed workforce through the self-employed scheme, 825 million of bounce-back loans, 460 million of business interruption support, all through the British Business Bank. And all of this represents more than £10 billion worth of support to date by the UK government, and represents the strength of a union being able to spread resources across the nations of the United Kingdom during tough times. And this level of support has been widely welcomed. I'm pressed. Yes, Mr Rumbles.
Mike Rumbles.
I thank Donald Cameron for giving way, and I would certainly accept that the UK government has done a great deal, £10 billion for Scotland. But there are a number of people that have fallen through the net because they're not included and I have to give credit also to the Scottish Government, who have covered some of that, but there are still people falling through the net. Do you think there's any room for manoeuvre to help those people?
Donald Cameron.
Well, I think the member makes a good point, and it's something that we have been pressing for some time. There are a number of workers and businesses who still indeed fall through the cracks. And there is another problem, that is the speed at which applications are being processed. But I would like to move on. I would say that the support from the UK government has actually been noted by others. Professor Gallagher stated the extent to which the UK government has spent money has probably surprised the government itself. And I, of course, welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary has consistently acknowledged that support from the... I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on, I've limited time. Acknowledges the support from the UK government, and it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge and welcome what the Scottish government has done during this crisis to mirror support schemes. And in that regard, can I welcome the extra support which has been announced today. But I would like to address some of the issues mentioned in the motion in relation to the fiscal framework and on more borrowing powers or flexibilities. Now, we will certainly await the published details of any proposals, and we cannot make any sort of commitment without seeing that, which is one reason why we cannot support several of the amendments today, despite sympathising with many of the points made by both the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. And of course, we accept that the pandemic is a unique event with ramifications none of us foresaw, least of all want, and thus a unique response is needed. However, many will treat the various calls for more borrowing powers or an urgent review of the fiscal framework with a heavy dose of scepticism. Let's recall a few facts. First, the fiscal framework was, of course, a joint effort concluded in good faith by the UK government and the SNP government of the day, led by John Swinney in the negotiations. And as many have noted, not least in their evidence to the Finance Committee, the fiscal framework is working currently as it should. It is doing what it says on the tin. The resilience of that framework is notable, and that fact should be recognised. Because despite the economic ravages of the virus, Scotland's budget this year is mostly insulated in terms of income tax revenue. Yes, I take it.
I thank Mr.
Stuart
Cameron.
McMillan.
I thank Mr. Cameron for taking the intervention, but would Mr. Cameron accept that when the fiscal framework was established from 2016, the economic situation that we face now, and also with Brexit, is somewhat different, to say the least, and therefore the fiscal framework does need to change?
Donald Cameron.
Well, I would accept that the fiscal framework protects the Scottish budget from UK-wide economic shocks, but managing any differential impact is the responsibility of the Scottish government. That's the principle underpinning the Smith Commission, and it works. It incentivises the Scottish government to grow the economy, but protects the budget. And here, the context is important when we talk about borrowing powers, because as a result of their budgetary decisions in government, again, pre-pandemic, the Scottish government requires to find some very significant funds to plug the £1 billion black hole in our finances due to tax reconciliations. And I don't want to spend more time going through the borrowing powers that the Scottish government already has, both in terms of resource borrowing, capital expenditure, and the Scotland Reserve. But the problem is the Scottish government has already substantially committed this borrowing even before the virus struck. We know for the first time the Scottish government has used its resource borrowing powers this year. We know that since 2015, the SNP government has borrowed some £2.5 billion in capital funds. And we know that the current sum left in the Scotland Reserve is £165 million, which in relative terms is a small sum. So having virtually maxed out the credit card with little left in the kitty, is it any wonder that there is cynicism when more credit is being sought? And it's not just from these benches. Experts before the Finance Committee said, quoting Professor Gallagher, that this issue was a red herring. And he was also very clear that the UK government's ability to borrow, even at negative interest rates, was a formidable weapon in the fiscal armoury. And that is not something that would be available to the Scottish government. So, drawing my comments to a close...
I'll give you a little extra time to take to
you.
intervention.
I'm grateful. Let me be clear. We do not see the need for a renegotiation of the current fiscal framework, and absolutely not in the midst of a crisis like the one we are experiencing, when the priority has to be public health and economic recovery. And of course, the fiscal framework is due to be reviewed next year. And finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, any debate on the fiscal implications of the pandemic should, of course, first be framed in terms of the human cost of lives lost tragically to this horrific disease, but we also require to compute the economic loss, and not just in terms of fiscal impact and the public finances. So I would contend that for workers and businesses in Scotland today, they are thinking day to day, week to week, about financial survival. And the Scottish Government is making political decisions that affect that, as the Cabinet Secretary candidly admitted last week when she said recovery could be slower here as a result of easing lockdown in a different way to the rest of the UK. And all our efforts should be focused on getting businesses back on track and rebooting our economy, ensuring long-term recovery and then growth so that our public finances are secure. That should be the unwavering, unstinting and unrelenting aim of everyone in this chamber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got practically no time in hand, I'm afraid, so interventions have to be absorbed. Sorry about that. I call on Jackie Bailey to speak to move Amendment 22033.2. Ms Bailey, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's fair to say that the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic will be far-reaching. We've seen the extraordinary pressures placed on our health and social care system, the personal challenges faced by individuals and families, and we're now starting to see the economic devastation and loss of jobs which will impact on every community across Scotland. Only today, ONS tell us that unemployment in Scotland has risen to 127,000, the highest of all the UK nations. And of course there is pressure on the public finances, some immediate and short-term pressures which require flexible approaches to be negotiated now, and longer-term issues which require careful negotiation in the year ahead. Both scenarios require governments to work together in the interests of the people. So I would caution the SNP not to come up with a shopping list of transitional demands which are not strategic. Let's not create grievance with the UK government as our starting point, but better to secure their agreement going forward. And I would also caution against ad hoc adjustments to the Barnett formula, because we know it serves Scotland well. I am a great believer in setting out what outcomes you want to achieve right at the start. So our primary objective should be to apply the maximum resources to rebooting the Scottish economy. That goes well beyond the detail of the fiscal framework. It means marshalling all the resources that will be available in Scotland directly from the UK government, as well as from the Scottish budget, into a coherent strategy. So as well as resources, we need a plan. And the reality is that plan needs to be integrated across different levels of government. Now, I welcome the announcement from the Cabinet Secretary about developing jobs. But the reprofiled capital, as I understand it, for 1 year. What happens in the following year? Because these initiatives will still, unfortunately, be required. And we need to support businesses. We need to support the development of a sustainable, greener economy. And at the moment, I don't see that integrated plan across all levels of government. It would be much easier for both governments to have a discussion about concrete proposals based on a shared understanding of the challenges faced across the country. Agreement about the fiscal levers then flow from that. Demands for more borrowing will undoubtedly land better if there were actual proposals about what to use the borrowing for. The scale of support from the UK government has been significant. That's been welcome. A third of the Scottish workforce is currently paid by the UK government. But the danger is we face a cliff edge in October, and I know businesses are already consulting on redundancies. So we need the UK government to stay at the table and deliver sector-specific job retention schemes in areas such as tourism and hospitality beyond October. There is, of course, the immediate challenge faced by the Scottish budget, and I absolutely agree that flexibility is required now. We know that income from land and building transaction tax is likely to fall. We equally know that spending on social security is likely to rise. Borrowing to cover the tax shortfall might be necessary, unless the Cabinet Secretary, of course, thinks that the 93 million remaining borrowing available this year, together with the Scotland Reserve of 165 million, is enough. Of course, there is already a problem with the budget that predates COVID-19. Both the Scottish Government and Fiscal Commission have overestimated our income tax take over the last 3 financial years, so that just shy of £1 billion needs to be repaid, 555 million in this year alone. Let me say to the Cabinet Secretary, I think it's reasonable to ask for some time to pay given the current circumstances. Let me turn to the question of asymmetric shocks. The fiscal framework provides for the possibility that COVID will turn out to be a substantial asymmetric shock, but not if it occurs as a result of the Scottish Government's decisions. Now, that is something that can be reviewed when the overall fiscal framework is considered. I am, of course, reminded, as others have done in the Chamber, that the fiscal framework was negotiated and signed off by John Swinney. He hailed it at the time as a great deal, but to be frank, it is now quite the reverse. The deal is bad for the Scottish Government, and let me say as gently as I can, the SNP have no one to blame for that other than themselves. We do need more flexibility, but finally, let me turn to local government, Presiding Officer. Much has been made in the past about parity of esteem between the Scottish Government and local government, but it is not borne out by the SNP's actions. In the period from 2013 to 2019, the cut to the Scottish budget from the UK Government has been 2%, but the cut to local government has been 7%. So the SNP have taken Tory austerity, given it a tartan ribbon, tripled it to then pass it on to local government. Now, in this pandemic, local government has stepped up to the plate, whether it's providing food parcels, organising childcare hubs, providing social care or processing business grants. Aside from the money that should have been passed to them, which is still outstanding, they have spent £145 million more up to June. And that's before we consider education. And in closing, Presiding Officer, let me touch on that. Because there is a clear need for national leadership, for resources, for guidance provided to local authorities. But instead, the Education Secretary and the Finance Secretary have in fact been stalling for weeks in the hope that there will be UK consequentials. Meanwhile, attainment plummets, the inequality gap grows, and parents are really struggling to homeschool. Presiding Officer, I would urge the SNP to go back to the drawing board, give councils the resources they need, because parents and children deserve better. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much, Ms Whaley. And now calling Patrick Harvey to speak to Move Amendment 22033.3. Mr Harvey, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I welcome the fact that we're having this debate. As the Cabinet Secretary said, we're having this debate in the context of budget revisions on a bigger scale than is typical in our in-year budget revisions. But that is largely a technical decision to pass the budget revision document. And what we need is the wider debate about the fiscal situation. Today's debate won't be the end of that by any means, but it is an important opportunity for us to begin to broaden out our discussion of the situation. All governments are responding to an emergency, a public health emergency and an economic emergency. And I don't think it would be reasonable to suggest that any government is doing so with perfect foresight or indeed with a clarity about how exactly they should use all of the tools available to them. But the fiscal response by governments is only one set of tools. It's important, but it's only one set of tools. And most governments can exercise it freely, without constraint, and in the context of wider macroeconomic powers. The Scottish Government is tightly constrained in the way that it can fiscally respond to this situation. And so it is critical that we make the case for wider UK action, as well as for wider flexibility for the Scottish Government to be able to take steps. Important steps have been taken so far, and we should recognise that. And I think the motion and the comments from the other parties does recognise it, but far more is going to be needed. The motion recognises that, recognises the limitations of what's possible, and is very clear that fiscal flexibility is required. Now, I think both the Labour and the Liberal Democrat amendments introduce very important points in relation to local government, and I agree with the sentiment of what both are suggesting. Both those amendments also delete substantial parts of the motion, and I'm not sure that the Liberal Democrat phrase that said additional flexibility should be considered is quite strong enough. I hope that in their closing speech, the Labour Party might confirm that where they say that they welcome the opportunity to review the fiscal framework next year, I hope that they're not closed off to the idea of immediate flexibility that could be introduced. And I give way.
Jackie Bailey.
Grateful for Patrick Harvey taking the intervention, but I confirmed in my speech that I think there are flexibilities required in the short term and therefore now.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful for that clarification, and I'm more sympathetic to the amendment in that context. As for the Conservative amendment, they say that the fiscal framework is currently operating as it should. Well, it might well be operating as it was designed to, but it was designed to hamstring and shaft the Scottish Government. I criticised it at the time. If I'd been in John Swinney's shoes, I would not have signed it off. But it is what we're working with now. It's not enough simply to say it's working as it should, any more than it should be enough to say that the operation of any part of our economy is working as it should when people are being exploited or when we have unsustainable economic activity. As for the phrase, maxed out the credit card, this one comes up time and time again. The Scottish Government have maxed out the credit card. I think it's quite a telling analogy, actually. I think it's quite honest in saying that's the kind of economic power that a Scottish Government ought to have. They can have a wee credit card, they can pay through the nose to use it, and they can have no meaningful powers that any other government would expect to have. Maxed out the credit card, what a piece of nonsense. I want to move on, Presiding Officer, to talk about the elements raised in my own amendment, because there are further steps that are absolutely going to be necessary, as other governments are recognising. And in fact, the European Union, on 27th of May, the Commission presented in Parliament a €750 billion economic stimulus plan, and this is in addition to, obviously, action being taken by Member States. I deeply regret that the UK will not have access to the ability to work collectively with other EU countries as a full Member State, but that is a result of UK government choices. And as for the affordability of the stimulus package that's going to be necessary, I would refer members to the work of the Resolution Foundation, which has said borrowing is high, but there is no sign that the government is struggling to fund itself. It points out the healthy levels of demand for the record volume of gilts issued since the lockdown. The Debt Management Office has successfully raised over $89 billion from gilt auctions since mid-March. It goes on later to say, even under a 12-month lockdown, the debt interest to revenue ratio, as a measure of the financial burden that debt imposes on the public finances, remains close to historic lows. So there is no question about the affordability of the stimulus package that's necessary, and it is clearly necessary. The job retention scheme also clearly, as Jackie Bailey said, and I would agree very much, needs to be extended beyond the immediate cut-off, particularly in relation to areas such as hospitality, if we want to avoid the horrendous levels of unemployment that we may be about to see. Finally, Presiding Officer, building back better will require the bold, courageous and creative role of the state, not just in stimulating but in steering recovery, not just in rebooting the economy but redesigning it to ensure that we achieve that fairer, more equal and greener economy that so many members talk about. We need to start putting it into practice. I move my amendment.
Thank you very much. I now call Willie Rennie to speak to move amendment 22033.4. Mr Rennie, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Deputy Presiding Officer. This debate is an important early discussion on what steps we should be taking, not only to restart our economy, but also to shape it for decades to come. Just as Liberals and Reformers worked on the new order that followed the Second World War, with the creation of the National Health Service, amongst other things, now is our responsibility and opportunity to build something new. But this is not just about dreamers. This is about delivery. I know from my inbox that people are hurting and they are worried about their future. 1 in 10 could be unemployed by the end of the year, and the economic hit could last for 3 years, if not longer. We need to give them comfort, certainty and hope. So the Chancellor's announcement later on this year about the recovery plan will be important. It is when decisions will be made about the size of the state, the level of the intervention, how we manage or pay off the debt and the level of the annual deficit. Our view is that if the UK government seeks to impose on itself a needless, masochistic rule to pay off the debt and operate too tight a fiscal arrangement, then it will snuff out any economic recovery. There is significant tolerance in the markets to greater borrowing by government. This is a global issue, so the UK is a relatively safe place to put your money. Equally, future generations would never forgive us if we leave them a massive debt without also leaving them a better country, stronger, fairer and greener. That means new green homes, more green energy, heat and electricity, more pay for those in the front line of the pandemic, including care home workers, new job schemes and support for our excellent universities. Not just now. So today's debate on the flexibilities in the fiscal framework may seem rather inconsequential in the scheme of things, but it is important nevertheless, as it deals with the immediate financial issues ahead of us, following the monumental effort by those who work for us across the public service. With the fraction of the time normally required, they have reinvented the state to come to the aid of businesses, of people and of communities. The enterprise agencies, local councils, the Scottish and UK governments and so many others have stepped up. So now is our time to step up for them. It needs to be noted that the support for Scotland from the UK is more than the funds that it supplies to the Scottish Government. It also includes the furlough scheme, the self-employment schemes and the various loans and grant schemes. And I'm afraid the Cabinet Secretary's motion doesn't include reference to that. These are giant economic stabilisers provided automatically by the UK Government, so they should be part of our discussions today. Take today's unemployment figures. It shows 30,000 more people out of work in the months until April. That's before the real teeth of the economic crisis will have bitten. Just those people alone will get £100 million of unemployment support direct to them. That's not money that comes through the Scottish Government's desk. It doesn't pass through their accounts. But it is important to people in Scotland. And where the economic shock is asymmetric, as today's unemployment figures are, then the system works to give more support to Scotland. Not just the Barnett share, not just now, of the lower English unemployment. I think the full analysis of the fiscal framework needs to have the full numbers included within it. Those are currently missing. That's why my amendment acknowledges the funding direct from the UK Government and suggests that the adjustments to the framework should be considered. I would expect that to be done if we get a fuller information, financial information from the Scottish Government. And we should, as Jackie Baillie recognised, we should recognise that the endless hours that John Swinney invested in coming up with the fiscal framework. At the time, he praised it as being fair to taxpayers, and he also thought it was a good agreement. It would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary, in her summing up, could set out some of the detail that she envisages in terms of the fiscal flexibilities that she seeks. We are prepared to support short-term flexibilities, as we do not believe those changes would fundamentally undermine the strength and benefits of the United Kingdom. It is right that the framework allows for the effects of decisions made by the Scottish Government to be felt by the Scottish Government. But that doesn't apply in the case of COVID-19. This is an exceptional event, and we should be covered to be able to cover that in the flexibilities. The construction industry has been largely absent for months, so it's no surprise the Scottish Government hasn't been able to spend its capital on some of that construction work. We should have flexibility in that area. The current borrowing requirements on resource are designed to deal with in-year management or budgeting errors. Yet greater borrowing to deal with a pandemic would be really helpful in this circumstance. So I think we should get flexibilities on that. Even though the Labour amendment today preempts my amendment, because it broadly is similar to my amendment, we will support it at decision time. And I would encourage the Scottish Government and others to support it too. But nevertheless, I will move my amendment, even though I hope we don't even get to it. Thank you.
Very gracious. Open debate, 6-minute speeches. Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Maurice Golden. Mr Crawford, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very glad we're having this debate this afternoon. I think it comes at just the right moment, and I sincerely thank party managers for enabling it. Presiding Officer, there's a fair bit of ground I'd like to cover today, but let me start with the fiscal framework agreed between the Scottish Government and UK governments following the work of the Smith Commission. I think it's in the main accepted here at Holyrood that even before the advent of COVID-19, the framework required reform, particularly with regard to the borrowing powers available to manage the risk and volatility arising from forecasting errors. That's not to say, of course, that the designers of the framework got it wrong. Only experience could have shown us where improvements might be required. The cries of blame from Jackie Baillie are not helpful in this context. That's why, after all, the review process was built into the agreement from the outset. However, I think it's fair to recognise in the face of these unprecedented times that at least in the short term, the agreement has provided a level of protection for spending power of the Scottish Government budget. However, what the COVID crisis has also demonstrated is that we do not have the reach in fiscal responsibility that is required to match the scale of the challenge we face as we seek to rebuild the Scottish economy. Presiding Officer, there is evidence emerging that the Scottish economy may suffer a greater downturn than the rest of the UK because of our larger relative footprint of oil and tourism-related activity. But there's also evidence suggesting that because the public sector is relatively larger and pay levels are on the whole a little more generous there in Scotland, this may prove something of a levelling out factor. As we all know, because of the way the fiscal framework operates, if the fall in economic activity in Scotland is greater than the rest of the UK, we will see our spending power reduce. Because of COVID-19, so too will our take from income tax, a potential double whammy. Now, time alone will tell us the true picture and what it is, but we'll not know the outcome of the reconciliation process until 2023-24 and the full extent of the reality that faces us. But, Presiding Officer, time is not on our side. We cannot afford to wait, and we must start pump priming the economy now if we're to keep unemployment to a minimum and avoid a tidal wave of debt and poverty. At this stage, let me say I very much welcome the support the UK Treasury has so far provided in the early stages in the fight against the impacts of COVID-19. Albeit, I agree with the Cabinet Secretary, there badly needs to be more certainty around Barnett consequentials. Commitments made must be honoured, otherwise a road of confusion, uncertainty and dispute lies ahead. Presiding Officer, if the Chancellor will not or cannot release the resources required to do the job of rebuilding Scotland, at the very least he must agree greater freedom from the borrowing straitjacket we currently find ourselves bound with. This does not need to be seen as a threat by those who do not wish to see this Parliament have greater responsibility. There is absolutely no reason why such additional flexibilities cannot be temporary in nature to enable this Parliament to respond effectively to the crisis we face. Simple measures, such as enabling capital to be spent on revenue as a short-term measure, could help deal with some very real challenges that our budget will very soon be facing. What is certain, not to act will leave this Parliament with the job of trying to rebuild Scotland with one hand tied behind its back, and that is simply not acceptable. In Scotland, we've got to be honest with people about the scale of the challenge we face, because potentially it could be horrible and it could be grim. Our job is to provide hope for the future and demonstrate that we're doing all we can to help rebuild to the best of our abilities. We therefore need to look to where new sources of revenue can be raised, either at a national or local level, perhaps targeted at those sectors of the economy that have significantly benefited from the COVID crisis. Where we don't have these powers stacked, we should encourage those at Westminster to do so. Yes, this may end up being a painful process for some and involve difficult political decisions. We must do it early and with resolve if we are to do our best for the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer, this will be a real test for this Parliament and a massive challenge for a minority government. Can we lay aside our political differences in the best collective interests of our citizens? I sincerely believe there will emerge from these difficult days thirst for a new kind of politics in this country, and I suspect that those who do not show willing to find new ways of coming together, of operating collaboratively, will pay a heavy price. From the amendments today, I can see that generally the Labour Party, the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats understand this need. The Tories and Donald Cameron have obviously some way to go to grasp this. Regrettably, that is the case, and they've attempted to turn today's debate into a constitutional rally. No one could have imagined we'd find ourselves in these unprecedented circumstances, but it's how, as a collective, we respond to the challenge of our age that history will come to judge us. Let us rise to that challenge and show the world this institution has found its time and come of age. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Crawford. I call Maurice Gold to be followed by Angela Constance. Mr Golden, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Coronavirus is the biggest economic challenge of our lifetimes, requiring a massive fiscal response, and that is exactly what the UK Government has provided. £10 billion has been ploughed into Scotland to fight the virus, £3.8 billion directly to the Scottish Government budget, and much more besides to save jobs, increase welfare payments and protect businesses. The scale of this intervention is staggering. Almost a third of the entire Scottish workforce, some 800,000 Scots, have had their jobs saved by the UK Government. That is on top of all the other UK Government measures, such as instructing banks to give mortgage holidays, instructing energy companies to help people struggling with bills, offering interest-free loans to businesses, boosting universal credit by £1,000 and much more besides. I hear derision from the SNP benches. That will come as cold comfort to those 800,000 Scots that the SNP presumably wish are receiving no furlough at this time. That is what those marks of derision speak to. In a second, the UK Government response has gone beyond many people's expectations. Jackie Baillie.
Jackie Baillie.
I very much welcome the job furlough scheme, but would the member agree that actually it needs to consider carry on beyond October, because we have a reliance on tourism and hospitality that will extend right into March? Will he argue for an extension of the job retention scheme for that specific purpose? Maurice Golden.
I think that we will see the recovery package from the UK Government, and it may be that there's elements that need to be looked at, particularly sector deals for tourism and hospitality. But I was making the point, which I concede was supported by the Labour Party, that indeed the furlough scheme is something to be welcomed. Of course, the SNP appear to be turning their backs on that support. I need to make some progress. The Chartered Institute of Taxation said the UK Government has responded with more largesse than one might have anticipated. The Finance Secretary has publicly praised the UK Government's response. Not to be outdone, the Economy Secretary took to the airwaves to describe the job retention scheme as a lifeline, and it has been, keeping the economy from collapse until it can be restarted. That is where our economic efforts should now be focused. Kate Forbes.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm pleased to have been quoted by the member in my welcoming of the furlough scheme. Can he remind the Chamber how it's been funded?
Maurice Golden.
Well, it's funded through the the £10 billion package that's been offered to Scotland and by the UK Government. And that £10 billion that's helped to fund those measures, including £3.8 billion from Barnett consequentials, is something that we should all be welcomed. However, we also require further action from the Scottish Government to act in tandem with the UK's efforts. If we consider the response over the last few weeks, it is worth noting that it was only last week that construction sites were allowed to reopen in Scotland. That is despite them having had safe working plans drawn up and English sites have been opened for weeks. Or on the manufacturing front, Scottish firms safely producing orders for the NHS, but barred from fully reopening and competing for contracts to secure their future. Businesses need more information regarding plans so they can prepare to get staff back, take bookings and open their doors again. We need an open conversation with businesses to deliver a balanced restart of our economy. More borrowing powers or even fiscal autonomy has been called for by the Finance Secretary, saying more powers were required to tackle the crisis. The reality is that full fiscal autonomy would lead to cuts and austerity. Public spending was almost £14,000 per person in Scotland before coronavirus, considerably higher than the £12,000 UK average. Full fiscal autonomy would mean an end to that extra spending. In the middle of an economic crisis, making every man, woman and child in Scotland £2,000 poorer is the last thing anyone should be arguing for. More borrowing powers for revenue is not the answer either. I'm not making a political point on this, it's purely an economic argument. In this scenario, we would have the bizarre situation where the Scottish Government would be utilising funds from the Bank of England without the regulatory oversight required as the lender of last resort. Therefore, without a union lock on such proposals, the likelihood of a default is high. More generally, the Scottish Government have already used up over half their borrowing capacity before the crisis, with the outcome that growth was projected to lag behind the rest of the UK for years to come. Full use of existing powers and the billions in support for Scotland should be the priority here, not arguing over new powers. Just the other week, the Associate Director of the IFS set out to the Finance Committee how our borrowing powers are not meant to address these long-term shortfalls.
And you must conclude, please.
This is the fiscal challenge ahead, not short-term fixes, but a prudent, long-term economic management. That's how we create jobs, boost wages and protect our NHS.
Thank you very much. And I call Angela Constance, to be followed by Alec Rowley. Ms Constance, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The stark reality is that what is required to combat COVID and protect our public services and care for our communities and build businesses far exceeds what is available in terms of the tools of the trade or indeed hard cash. And this debate today is about the here and now. It's about the budget, its revisions, the fiscal framework, all of which impacts on every aspect of economic and social justice in this country. So this debate is also about our shared future and the Scotland we seek. And as we look to life beyond lockdown, we need to start to rewrite the rules and rebuild an economy that is more democratic, entrepreneurial and fairer. In times of crisis, it is always those with least that suffer the most. Therefore, we need a resilient economy that can't be blown off course when it comes to jobs, proper pay and ending poverty. But where do we start? Well, let me start by declaring an interest as I sit on the board of Commonweal, and in a recent publication they made 3 suggestions for the here and now. The first 2 could be done at the stroke of a pen by Westminster, and that is removing the borrowing cap and giving full dispensation to the Scottish National Investment Bank. The third action is around public procurement, which has come on leaps and bounds under the Scottish Government, but there is more to do. And I've always been very interested in the work done by Preston Council when they systematically increased the proportion of their budget that was invested and spent locally. And I am being political, Presiding Officer, when I say we have a problem, but not all the tools to sort it. Indeed, the Finance and Constitution Committee received evidence that the fiscal framework is not designed for a crisis when you need to be fleet of foot. Instead, we sit and wait on Westminster, developing, costing and announcing, and then we wait on the cheque arriving in the post. And we know that consequentials can be revised downwards as well as upwards, a risk highlighted by Audit Scotland, amongst others. And we don't even have the ability to transfer capital to resource funding, not exactly radical, just a simple, flexible measure that most other countries have. And the UK Government can borrow to fund additional COVID-related spend. The Scottish Government can't. The UK can borrow long-term, cheaply, with no binding limits. The Scottish Government, by contrast, has to balance its budget, yet other OECD countries have relaxed some of the rules for devolved administrations. And will we even be allowed greater access to the National Loan Fund? And I am glad that the UK Government seemed to have got over their austerity-driven aversion to borrowing. I have never understood the logic of government opting out and pleading prudence, yet content instead to see individuals, families and businesses burdened by debt, insecurity and poverty. I'm also a bit disappointed that Alec Neil isn't speaking today, because he would be arguing for Scotland's share of the £645 billion that the Bank of England is printing for the UK Government. But the big question is, of course, how are we going to support economic recovery without more borrowing powers and additional flexibility? The choice for Westminster is, will they give us more powers or more money? And I worry about how one of the most fiscally centralised governments in the world will answer that question, which will mean that the choices for the Scottish Government may be completely unpalatable. And those of us who represent or who were raised in constituencies that still bear the scars of unemployment from the 1980s or the financial crash of 2008 will be desperate not to go back to the future. And the prospect of unemployment reaching 10% or more is grave, particularly given that this would mean a correspondent rise in youth unemployment 2 to 3 times higher, possibly reaching 30%. And constituencies like my own, according to the Social Market Foundation, our local economy, because of the nature of it, face the disproportionate impact of the double whammy of Brexit and COVID. So, Presiding Officer, the choice for those of us who want to see a jobs guarantee scheme, a citizen's basic income, more investment in housing, the choice for those of us who want to see the maximum response to the biggest crisis of our lives, the choice for those of us who are looking to life beyond lockdown and want to rewrite the rules, is how, when Westminster says no, that we say yes and work together for the right powers, for the right purpose.
Thank you very much, Ms Constance. And I call Alec Rowley to follow by Kenneth Gibson. Mr Rowley, please.
Presiding Officer, in speaking in this debate today, I would want first to acknowledge and pay tribute to all those who have continued to work on the front line throughout this crisis, providing key services and goods to meet the basic needs of the population. This could not have been easy when considering the threat of an unknown and deadly virus, but the shop workers, the food producers, the drivers, the cleaners and of course our frontline care staff all deserve recognition and thanks. And is it not ironic that amongst all these workers we have some of the most undervalued and underpaid within our economy? So in looking at how we restart and rebuild the economy, we must not simply want to get back to where we were, for where we were was not so good. And indeed, the lack of resilience within the economy has been exposed like never before with this virus. Low pay is not just bad for those poorly paid, it is bad for the whole economy. So any detailed plan being brought forward by the government must at its core be built on ending low pay in our economy. And that is also true of an economy that is built on and dependent on people and businesses running up unsustainable amounts of debt. Spice have reported that unsecured consumer credit across the UK reduced by £3.8 billion in March 2020, compared to an average monthly increase of £1 billion for the previous 12 months. So there must surely be a realisation that you cannot build and maintain a successful economy based on consumer debt. It is Tory dogma, private debt good, public debt bad, that has in this pandemic fallen apart. And that is why Scottish Labour does support the view that this Parliament must have greater ability to borrow to invest in Scotland's future. Government borrowing to invest in the economy is something that must happen and is key to any recovery plan. I also note that Commonweal, in their recent publication on the way forward, calls for the Scottish National Investment Bank to be given immediate dispensation from the UK Treasury to be recognised as a proper bank and as such can invest to stimulate the Scottish economy. Last week I asked the Finance Secretary to bring forward a paper outlining where further powers are required, and I do hope that she will do so in order that we can get on the same page of understanding how the Government intends to move forward in this economic crisis. I would have to say, however, that the Government's record on investing and supporting companies in, for example, offshore wind, has not resulted in jobs for Scotland. Indeed, it would seem every country but Scotland. It is a disgrace that we have yards in Methil, Burnt Island and Stornoway lying empty when the work to build the wind farms around the coast of Scotland is going everywhere but Scotland. I read recently that the French Finance Minister has told the car industry in France that the state will stand by them, but on the condition that the vehicle production is gradually repatriated to French shores. It is not simply the state putting money in for the profiteers to take the rewards, but the state must increasingly have a greater role within the economy and ensure that the rewards are distributed and remain within the economy. Can I also make clear that the current financial framework is putting an enormous pressure on Scotland's finances and must be renegotiated? How any government putting Scotland's interests first could have signed up to this is somewhat baffling, and this must be addressed. It will also be important that we learn from the last financial crash, and the greatest lesson from that is that failed Tory austerity must not and never be again an option. The Tories' decision to impose deep austerity on the least able did not just cause human misery, it actually damaged and held back economic growth. Failed Tory austerity also resulted in a situation where frontline public services were not in any shape to face a global pandemic, and it is only down to the dedication and commitment of frontline workers that we have been able to struggle through this last period. And that is why the Scottish Government must recognise the very real financial pressures and difficulties that councils up and down Scotland have. If we want to open up our schools, if we open up our councils will require far greater finance than they have to date. There needs to be a clear commitment to put more funding into education and into other areas within the economy that we want to get moving. We also must recognise the role of local government in driving the economy, and that is why, Presiding Officer, in concluding, I would say that there must be a new relationship, a new deal between local and central government with a common objective of driving forward the economy in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Graham Simpson.
Presiding Officer, across Scotland, 628,000 jobs are furloughed, 14,000 in North Ayrshire, a ticking time bomb for when furlough ends. Today is the last date by which large employers can give staff 45 days notice of redundancy before national insurance and pension contributions resume on the 1st of August. Sadly, some will issue those notices. Furlough must be extended. The 2016 Fiscal Framework Agreement between the Scottish and UK governments must work for Scotland, and greater flexibility is needed, as the Fraser of Allender Institute and indeed a number of members have said. Under the framework, If we need to go further than the UK on coronavirus-related measures, other areas of spending may have to be cut, as has already happened in Wales. And it's a matter of public record that during discussions on the fiscal framework in the last Parliament, as a number of members appear to have forgotten, both Labour and the Tories in this place were willing to accept an early deal that would have cost Scotland £7 billion over a decade had John Swinney not dug in his heels. We are in deep recession with unemployment rising steadily, lives ruined, hopes and dreams dashed. Saving lives has been our collective priority. Thankfully, infections are now in steady decline and the economy must increasingly take centre stage. Confidence in the future is critical, as is a sober appraisal of where we are. Doomster talk of a possible viral spike this winter will simply depress consumption, increase precautionary behaviour, cut demand and increase unemployment further. At a time when all government, economic and fiscal powers must be harnessed to recovery, Scotland's lack of powers has never been so glaring. Members are aware of the straitjacket we are in and the limited room for manoeuvre Scottish ministers have, despite them performing heroically. The Cabinet Secretary rightly requested the devolution of more powers, particularly borrowing. However, we must also insist on devolution of the funds that go with them. The UK Government has form on this. When council tax benefit was devolved, only 90% of funding came with it, forcing Scottish ministers to cough up £17 million a year, with £22 million coming from local government. Sneakily, employment programmes were cut by 92% just before they were devolved. Now their increase provoked even a cheep from the Tory benches in this place. Scottish ministers are therefore in the unenviable position of looking to a capricious UK Government to help weather the storm whilst optimising its own fiscal resources. Budgets should be trawled for areas where the pandemic has reduced expenditure and savings can be made without damage. Indeed, £255.2 million of existing expenditure has already been reprioritised. Two other areas spring to mind which will not impact on struggling communities or inflict austerity. Several times I've raised the fact that booming supermarkets have been excused non-domestic rates for this financial year. This amounts to tens of millions of pounds, and supermarkets should be asked to resume payments from the 1st of July. Resources saved could then be reallocated, not least to the pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, helping hard-pressed and job-rich sectors of our economy, such as hospitality and tourism. I also make a plea for island communities. Enthusiastic social distancing in the Caledonian Isles will cut capacity from 1,000 to a feeble 75, making recovery from the pandemic nigh and impossible for Arran's tourist businesses. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Neil Finlay.
Mentions Arran. I'm sure he will welcome the building of council houses on Arran for the first time in a long time by North Ayrshire Labour Council. Angela Constance mentioned the excellent work being done in Preston. Would you also commend the excellent work being done in North Ayrshire under Joe Cullinan's leadership, which is very much working in collaboration with Preston?
I'm not a big fan of protectionism, so I won't actually congratulate him on that. And as far as the 34 council houses are concerned, that wouldn't happen without the money coming from this government. We all remember the 6 council houses built by the last Labour administration in Shetland. Before the pandemic hit home, ministers decided that EU students studying in Scotland from this autumn would have their fees paid by Scottish taxpayers, despite their withdrawal from the EU. Last year, that figure was £97.8 million. If EU students are charged fees, their numbers might fall, but fees paid, together with resources currently provided in support of EU students, would undoubtedly assist higher education, which is desperately short of money following the loss of non-EU student income. Brexit is also certain to damage our economy and finances. Of course, it's hard to see the economy getting back on track with rising productivity and recovery in our fiscal position if schools are blended and parents have to take more time off to look after their children. It's increasingly clear that the ongoing permanent damage to children's education, along with diminished social interaction and an increasing incidence of mental health problems, is becoming disproportionately high relative to the risk now posed by COVID-19 to children. Importantly, this government does not have the resources to recruit the thousands of extra teachers. Even if they existed, the EIS and others demand to teach smaller classes, and ministers should say so. Even before lockdown, people suffered a loss of individual economic power, with low productivity, growth across the UK, stagnant income since the financial crisis, and stubbornly high levels of poverty and inequality. Many workers are financially insecure, in stark contrast to tax-dodging elites which salted money into overseas havens while corporate executive pay rocketed. Solutions, while Scotland remains devolved, lie at Westminster. We must press them to act, not only to devolve more resources and the flexibility to use them to invest in infrastructure, which has a higher gearing effect than revenue expenditure, support our public services, back threaten job-rich sectors of our economy and our entrepreneurs, but also to strengthen our fiscal position by tapping into new revenue sources, taxing online giants such as Amazon, Apple, Facebook and Google for the private data they hold on us, and online retailers to level the playing field with our seriously challenged high streets would all help. Presiding Officer, as I urged in March, coronavirus profiteering must be tackled by the UK Government, which has the powers to act. The Competition and Markets Authority has little power, however HMRC has. In both world wars it imposed taxes of over 100% where necessary, and in 1981 and 82, Mrs Thatcher's Tory Government imposed profiteering taxes on banks and oil companies respectively, followed by Labour in 1997 with its windfall tax on privatised utilities. Scottish ministers should lobby for the UK Government to act, with Scotland getting its rightful share of consequentials.
Can I remind members that we have absolutely no spare time in this debate. Graham Simpson, followed by John Mason.
Sir, these are difficult times for all of us, and the pain of lockdown is starting to bite. The downsides are becoming obvious. Now, having a debate today about the financial implications, and these are many, what began as a reaction to a public health crisis is causing potentially catastrophic long-term damage, not only to health and well-being, but our ability to cope in public services too. Much of the heavy lifting for government has been done by councils, and it's them that I wish to focus on. It seems to me that councils in Scotland are undervalued by government. They always are. They always have to fight for every penny they get, and it's never enough. It's the same every year, as Jackie Bailey said, and it's been exacerbated during this crisis. Council finance chiefs have been doing an ongoing exercise on costs associated with this crisis. The Finance Secretary knows all about this because she hung on for the first set of figures until agreeing to hand over £155 million inconsequentials to councils. The exercise and the cash weren't linked though, so this was just a time-wasting ruse. Eventually, she did start paying up, albeit in weekly instalments. So far, so slow, and I really don't know why. Now, council finance chiefs... Yes, I will.
Kate Forbes.
I was just wondering how long the member thinks the Scottish Government should hang on until we're given the £155 million from the UK Government in the first place.
Graham Simpson.
Well, as the Finance Secretary should know, I referred to that in a speech last week, and I think they should pay up. They definitely should pay up. Council finance chiefs' first set of figures showed a £100 million black hole, even after the £155 million had been paid. We never did hear how that would be plugged. Perhaps the government should have acted quickly, because then they wouldn't have been caught out by last week's updated set of numbers. Now, anyone who knows anything about black holes will know they can easily get bigger and become what astronomers call supermassive black holes. We're not there yet, but we're heading in that direction. That £100 million gap has already ballooned to £145 million. Let's run through some figures. Immediate mobilisation, £95.7 million. Loss of income and other costs, £189.5. Savings not achieved, £31 million. Council tax, buoyancy, bad debt and cash flow, £9.5 million. Known significant unique costs, £52.3 million. Capital costs, £48 million. Then you take away reduced costs as a result of COVID and you arrive at 145.5, and that figure is only going to get bigger. This is grim. So grim that COSLA have apparently given up trying to get more money out of the SNP and are turning to the Chancellor. And I suppose that given he's provided £10 billion in Scotland to help fight COVID-19, then you can hardly blame them. COSLA's working with their counterparts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland in appealing to Rishi Sunak for extra help. They've even asked Kate Forbes to join their campaign. You couldn't make it up. Mr. Sunak has proved himself to be a generous man when it comes to helping Scotland. So you never know. You never know. But there's a risk. There is a risk, Deputy Presiding Officer, that if he hands the money to Kate Forbes, councils will be back to square one, begging for her to hand it over to them. Overall, UK-wide, there's been an enormous package of measures put in place to help individuals and companies. Of course, there have been gaps, but that's inevitable. We've all had people complaining that they've missed out on various schemes. What I was not expecting was that the goalposts would be moved. I learned last week that in a crafty and largely unpublicised move, the deadline for applying for business grants will not be March the 31st next year, but July the 11th this year. And that's going to catch out a few businesses, and it seems pretty cynical to me. The Scottish Government has also told councils that if they have any money left over in the business support pot, they have to hand it back to them. And given that councils are in such a tough financial position, it might be worth the Cabinet Secretary cutting them some slack. I do have a concern that as we emerge from lockdown, there are going to be some big bills to pay. I do worry that government and councils will try to claw back money by hiking taxes. It would be cruel, would it not, that the damage caused by lockdown in terms of jobs, mental and physical health, and a lost generation in our schools, maybe, would be paid for by the very people that it's harmed. That would be government penalising the people for the effect of their own policies. I hope that does not happen. We need to plan a recovery, and strangling businesses and the public with higher taxes of all sorts is not going to be the way to do it. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has a tough job on our hands. I encourage her to continue to work closely with the Treasury. I encourage her to do right by councils, and maybe we can get through this into a new, brighter normal.
John Mason, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As the motion says, I think we can and we should be appreciative of much that the UK has done in response to the COVID pandemic. The 80% furlough scheme has been much appreciated by both businesses and individual staff within my constituency. Other business support was put in place quickly, and although using the rates register was not perfect, it did give a solid base to start from. Attempts have been made to fill in gaps, and I have to say I think some confirmation of a business's legitimacy had to be required. I know there have been problems with not having a business bank account or not having employees paid through PAYE, but we know that there have been cases of attempted fraud around grants in the past, particularly in Glasgow. Clearly, this kind of support has hugely increased public expenditure in Scotland and the UK over the last 3 months. And that expenditure has been financed by UK borrowing. So the UK deficit and debt has greatly increased, the latter to some £2 trillion. That equates to about £30,000 per head in the UK. Now, can the UK actually afford this? Can each of us actually afford that £30,000 debt? Or for a family of 4, that means £120,000. Should we now borrow more to fund a recovery? Is there an upper limit to which the UK cannot borrow beyond? Traditionally, when a country spent much more than it earned, inflation has often been allowed to rise in order to reduce the value of the debt. That also tends to mean higher interest rates. I remember when I bought my flat for £25,000 30 years ago in 1990, that the interest rates were 15%. And that was a bit scary, as I could not have afforded the mortgage if interest rates had gone much higher. Thankfully, they came down. Could inflation and interest rates take off again? Yes, it is possible. So what are the other options for dealing with this deficit and debt? The UK could just keep on borrowing, and they could give us in Scotland more power to do so as well. And that may well be justifiable for boosting the economy through capital investment and for short-term timing differences. However, I do not believe that in the longer term, borrowing to finance current revenue expenditure is sustainable. It pushes the problem down the road and will damage our children and grandchildren. When a household hits financial problems, more borrowing is seldom the answer. Neither is it often the right answer for a country. Another option for the UK government is to cut spending. That has been the traditional route of the Conservatives for balancing the budget and has led to this much detested term of austerity. I very much oppose going down that route again, and potentially it could be even worse than before, given that the UK is in an even weaker state than it was previously. So the main other option for the UK, and the option which I certainly favour, is to increase taxation, raising more from existing taxes or introducing new or perhaps windfall taxes. The reality is that some organisations, and supermarkets have been mentioned already by Mr Gibson, and individuals like ourselves, are either better off or at least no worse off than before this crisis. I personally am better off as I am on a fixed salary and I have not been spending money on clothes, meals, football or even haircuts. So people like me could afford to pay some more income tax or VAT or whatever. Okay, yes.
Bob Doris.
Mr Mason, you mentioned about those that are doing well during this crisis could pay a little bit more. Do you recall the public health supplement that large retailers in this place had the power to levy a tax on? I think that raised somewhere in the order of £70 or £80 million over 3 years. I'd have to check those figures, but it's certainly money that could be deployed to get the economy started to help the most vulnerable people.
John Mason.
Yes, well, I think that's exactly the kind of example, and I think Mr Gibson also gave examples of some of the online shopping companies and so on that could definitely afford to pay more tax. So we should look at that. Now, if the UK does go down that route with more taxation, we in Scotland will obviously need to decide how to respond ourselves. If it's something like increased corporation tax or VAT or inheritance tax or maybe a new wealth tax, then it would be reserved and will impact on all of the UK. However, if it's partly a devolved tax like income tax, then we would need to decide whether to match it or go further. Now, in relation to taxation, I was just reading a very useful paper produced by ICAS, and I should say I'm a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland, which was produced in May, entitled The Future of Taxation in the UK. ICAS makes the point that the coronavirus pandemic may give us an opportunity to generate public support for tax reform. There is strong public support clearly at the moment for the NHS, so it could be an ideal moment for a public debate about who should pay tax and how much they should contribute. And that leads me to my final main point: how are we as a Parliament going to manage our budgets going forward? In recent years, the aim in our budget process seems to have been to spend as close to our funding limits as possible. This has seemed obvious given the clear needs of our health services, local government, public transport, support for industry, etc., and all parties seem to have agreed on that. The Tories might have had us reduce tax, meaning fewer resources, and Labour wanted higher taxes and more resources, but both, and all of us in fact, I think wanted to spend all of these resources. And if there was a few hundred million left at the end of the year, less than 1% of the budget, there was immediate criticism of poor management and that should have been spent. So I think we have to look at going forward as to whether we are going to put aside money as reserves or whether we are going to spend every single penny we have. But in conclusion, by all means, let us use borrowing at both a UK and Scottish level to get us through this crisis and to get the recovery started. But going forward, we need to get our finances onto a more sustainable footing, and taxation has a big part to play in that. Thank you.
Contributions no more than 6 minutes, please. Sarah Boyack to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate could not be more timely. Only yesterday, Councillors Stephen McCabe, COSLA's education spokesperson, and Gail McGregor, finance spokesperson, highlighted that once Scottish Government funding is taken into account, they have had to spend an extra £145 million already to deal with the additional cost of the pandemic. We all know that councils have transformed their services and, as we speak, are preparing to reopen schools in August. Now, I had hoped that the joint work between the Scottish Government and our authorities was going to give more certainty about plans for the autumn. But it's really clear that there's still a massive challenge with mixed messaging from the Scottish Government. One day the Deputy First Minister says one thing, the next day the First Minister says another. And John Swinney had implied that we'd see blended learning happening until Christmas, but that was shot down by the First Minister, who says that all school students need face-to-face lessons with teachers. Now, we all know our councils are facing an impossible situation because after over a decade of underfunding, they have been working hard to implement the Scottish Government's policy guidance on reopening schools, but without any indication of the Scottish Government being committed to funding their plans. And I am worried because the time to get it right is running out, so we need Scottish leadership now. There are major challenges to meet the social distancing requirements in terms of capacity in our schools, where many are already at capacity. Then there's the issue of the additional staff that will be required. It will cost more money if we're to see school students being able to get back to school to the scale that will enable parents to get back to work, which is something parents are all beginning to think about now, and at the same time to see social distancing and support and safety delivered, not just for children, but also their teachers and vital support staff. We will need additional staff to clean our schools and potentially manage and clean the additional buildings which will need to be brought into use to deliver teaching. Now, as Jackie Bailey said, we're already seeing school students losing out because of lack of support, lack of IT kit. My understanding is that in Edinburgh alone, the current plans that they are looking at are estimated to cost £12 million. But I also understand from reading the headlines in today's evening news that John Swinney is not happy with those proposals. But what are Edinburgh to do? There are no funding commitments to let them impose more radical proposals that would meet people's needs, that would meet both the needs of teachers, of parents and of school students. There is a real challenge in here. If we look at other areas, there's gaps in Fife. Their colleagues there are looking at a potential gap of £15 million to cover opening up schools and continuing free school meals. In Midlothian, doesn't sound so much, the current estimate is £2 million, but their budget is smaller overall. That's still a lot of money. And also, just to top that, they've been billed £1.5 million by the SQA, even though they will not be using any of their services this year. Then there's the issue of school buses and the challenge of getting enough buses to get the social distancing that is needed. Councils have been raising this for weeks now. So in Midlothian, instead of around 30 buses, they might need 90 buses. There's a real reality check about getting the plans in place. And from today's topical questions, it was incredibly disappointing that there was no clarity on funding, absolutely no commitments from the Deputy First Minister. Now, in her evidence, yes, it's timely, have an intervention.
Member, and I think many of the points you raise are worthy of consideration. But this goes to the heart of the reason for this debate, which is I can see on the horizon a whole host of different cost pressures, whether it's transport, education or otherwise. Right now, we are already meeting a shortfall in our COVID financial need. Where are we going to get additional resource if it's not with additional powers?
Sarah Boyack.
Well, that goes to the heart of it. It is not funding challenges in the horizon. It's funding challenges now. Councils have already, let me contribute my contribution. I've already let you in. Councils have already put their council tax up using their powers. Scottish Government could give councils many more powers, many more opportunities to have fiscal flexibility that you have not given them. We know there are things like the tourism levy. It's not massive, but it would begin. Well, in my council, it would mean £13 million. And when they're looking at a gap of £40 to £50 million, £13 million would be useful. Now, if I could just continue, Presiding Officer, COSLA's leadership are absolutely clear that recovery is going to make it even harder because the previous funding cuts that Jackie Bailey mentioned are already making them having to make difficult decisions. And we need to look, coming out of COVID-19, how do we support those sectors that are critical to our economy, that are critical to society, and that are critical to the next generation. And there is much more the Scottish Government can do. Their budget is a lot bigger than the local authority budget, and there is more that I know that can be done to scrutinise where resources can come from. In the last climate statement we had just a few minutes ago before we started this debate, there were hints dropped by the Cabinet Secretary there might be more investment. What are we going to see in terms of the transformation of investment in our local economies that can come from other Scottish Government investment? For example, looking at our communities, looking at tackling fuel poverty, looking at building the kind of community heat networks that are vital if we're going to see jobs created, that we're going to see carbon emissions reduced, and we're going to see our local economies regenerated. The point that was made by Alec Rowley, where are we going to see the Scottish Government using its influence now? If we're going to get massive offshore wind contracts, will they be built in Scotland? Will the Scottish Government use its influence so that our local economies will see companies getting contracts to build vital infrastructure that we know we can build in Scotland? There is more the Scottish Government needs to do, and today's debate is a chance to highlight what we can do together. Thank you.
Can I just warn members that may have to be cutting the final speeches? Stuart McMillan, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this is a debate and a situation that nobody in this chamber will have wanted, and it's also clear that the financial implications for Scotland are vast, and no matter which way anyone looks at the challenge ahead of us, there is no easy route to take. This isn't a debate about independence versus the Union. That debate will return. But this debate today is about the here and now. It's about our constituents, it's about our local businesses, it's about our high streets, and also about our communities. Today's debate is about how best we protect every citizen in this country with the economic effects of this awful pandemic, which has sadly taken too many lives and affected families forever. And I want to pay tribute to both the Scottish and the UK governments for the schemes that have been introduced so far. I know it's been a fast-moving situation with guidance changing regularly, but it's undeniable that the schemes that have been introduced will save livelihoods and give them a chance as the economy opens up. There have been failings in the schemes, as colleagues have already alluded to, and not every business has been saved, and not every business has received finance. Some of this is highlighted, sadly, the various business practices that operate, and that certainly is a discussion for another day. But, Presiding Officer, there are a number of facts that are undeniable. Spending in measures to counter the COVID-19 pandemic has reached just over £4 billion. The Scottish Government operates within a tight fiscal framework with limited fiscal powers. The UK Government must provide certainty when announcing funding for Scotland to tackle the COVID crisis, and full fiscal responsibility would provide Scotland with greater flexibility and opportunities to encourage sustainable economic growth, increase tax receipts and also invest in public services. As we've heard today, the Scottish Government has prioritised £255 million from within its existing budget, and the room to manoeuvre is very much limited. The Tories today and previously have suggested reprioritising the Scottish Government budget. Now, that is happening, but it's limited. If budgets were only to be reprioritised, then what would the UK Government have done to reprioritise? If it didn't borrow the estimated £300 billion, the financial support, which has been welcomed, would not have happened. Even more jobs would have been lost, and even more of an economic catastrophe would have occurred, and even more lives would have been destroyed. The UK Government borrowed the money as they have the powers and the flexibility to do so. MSPs need to remember that we will be paying our share of the borrowing costs. So it's not a handout or charity from London, it's our money and it will be our share of the debt. The UK Government needs to both provide the powers but also provide absolute certainty when making financial announcements. The announcement from London on the 2nd of May that the Scottish Government were to receive £60 million in Barnett consequentials was welcomed, and the Scottish Government did the right thing by allocating that resource, only to then be told that their money will not be coming to Scotland. Also in April, the £35 million of consequentials was then reduced to £25 million by the Treasury. It was also the example that's been touched upon earlier of the £155 million for local authorities that the opposition continually demanded that the Scottish Government pay out. The Scottish Government hadn't even received the money, but were been told to pay that money out. So, Presiding Officer, if the UK Government want to help, but they don't want to allocate any other financial resources that they have borrowed, then they must provide this Parliament with the powers to aid our constituents. The fiscal framework has been spoken about already, and the political points have certainly been made. But this also highlights that the fiscal framework needs to be examined. This fiscal framework would not have been designed for a pandemic such as COVID. This shouldn't be a surprise to the Tories in the Chamber, and also certainly, sadly, ties in with the catastrophe that's going to be Brexit, which will have a hugely negative economic effect upon Scotland, whether we'll leave with or without a deal. 2 weeks ago in the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, the former Permanent Secretary at the Department for Exiting the European Union, Philip Rycroft, gave evidence. I asked him about the economic modelling after Brexit undertaken by the UK Government, which was published in November 2018. He said, and I quote, "I've made the point that the modelling was done by the UK Government, which was published in 2018, was consistent with a lot of the modelling that was done by other groups of economists. I stand by that." He continued, "What the modelling did not accommodate at all because, of course, it could not have done was the impact of the coronavirus on macroeconomic conditions, around which I absolutely accept that there are huge uncertainties. Presiding Officer, so if the Brexit economic modelling wasn't fit to deal with a pandemic, according to the former Permanent Secretary, then how can the fiscal framework be fit for purpose? It cannot. The financial purpose of this Parliament needs to be amended to ensure even more citizens can both be protected, in addition to giving our economy a fighting chance as we move forward. And if the Tories don't want to consider that the fiscal framework needs to be amended, if they think the fiscal framework is fine, then they need to tell this chamber and Scotland what budgets should be reprioritised, and also from where that money should come from. And also, do they want money to come from feeding our children to go into business? Do they want money to come from the health service to go into education? Or would they actually remove the recently announced 62 million for the Energy Transition Fund for the North East to give it to something else? The Tories need to tell Scotland what they would do. Thank you very much.
Michelle Ballantyne, followed by Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No one doubts that the economic consequences of COVID-19 are going to take years to recover from. And equally, there is a recognition across this chamber that the UK Government and the Scottish Government have stepped up and responded financially in a manner not witnessed before. Billions of pounds has flowed to Scotland under the fiscal framework to support individuals and businesses at this critical time. 3.7 billion is now expected to come directly to the Scottish Government through Barnett consequentials. And although the Cabinet Secretary is correct that initial announcements are estimates, so far throughout this crisis, those figures have been revised upwards, not downwards. I have heard the Cabinet Secretary repeatedly call for borrowing powers and a change to the fiscal framework since the start of her tenure, not since the start of COVID. But I am still waiting for an answer, and I did ask this question last week, as to whether the Cabinet Secretary is suggesting that she wishes to keep all the current benefits and the consequentials that exist and add more borrowing powers on top of that. And the contribution we've just heard pointed out that we all have to pay this bill. All taxpayers will have to pay this bill. Just let me finish this point. If we are adding more borrowing powers, then Scottish taxpayers will have to pay more towards the bill. That won't help, that will hinder. I'll take your intervention.
Kate Forbes.
I thank the member for the question. There's two answers. First of all, in terms of the borrowing powers, some have alluded to the fact already we have borrowing powers. We've got borrowing powers for the wrong reasons. Borrowing powers for cash management. I don't need to manage cash. I need to respond to a pandemic. So the point is that the reason needs to be accurate for those borrowing powers. And the second point on Barnett consequentials, we recognise, the welcome investment, but the point remains that they are estimates. They can be revised, they can up or down, and all we're asking for is guarantees. At an extraordinary time, we need extraordinary measures.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Well, I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary understands that consequentials often come from different departments across Westminster, and until those departments actually spend that money, the consequential isn't realised. But that is just a fact of the way things work. And like most businesses and organisations, you have to work with some of the unknowns in terms of your budget. But the reality of Scotland's fiscal challenge sits not only as a result of COVID-19, but as a direct consequence of policy decisions prior to COVID and those that will be taken now and as we look to recover from the hit our economy has taken. Prior to COVID, as has been said quite eloquently by a number of members, our local authorities were already struggling with a debt burden that now exceeds £15 billion, even before the impact of the virus, and with their full range of revenue-generating activities. Councils were facing having to find millions of pounds in savings, as well as putting up council tax significantly. But many of the fiscal challenges of COVID will now fall to our local authorities, and there is no question that they are rightly extremely worried. The Scottish Government needs to consider the risks it is willing to take. Lockdown was implemented to protect our NHS and save lives, and the response from the public, frankly, was heartwarming. Lockdown was predominantly voluntary, but families and businesses responded, and the UK Government and the Scottish Government provided financial support to try and ensure the impact on individuals was minimised. But it was never meant to go on long term. We did protect the capacity of our NHS, and frontline workers in the care sector and the food supply chain have stepped up, and we now need to ensure that we don't undermine everything that has been done by allowing our economy to deteriorate any further than it needs to. Every day I get emails from people who have invested their lives and money in building their businesses, providing employment, giving their children the best opportunities. They need the economy to be unlocked. They need the Scottish Government to explain the scientific reasons for keeping Scotland in lockdown longer than the rest of the UK. The extension of furlough would not in itself save many businesses, as they will increasingly be unable to meet their fixed overheads, and their customers may not return as they may find their supply needs elsewhere. If our schools do not return, our children's education will fall further behind. We can argue, we can insult each other in this political bubble that we all live in, but the fiscal challenge for many means the loss of their job, their home, their future. I know that making decisions that put people's lives at risk is frightening, but the COVID virus is one risk, and I wonder whether hindsight is going to change many people's perspective on some of the decisions we're now making. The recovery plans for the UK and Scotland have yet to be seen by most of us, and I, for one, am extremely concerned that the impact of lockdown on people's lives will be far more devastating than the virus itself. The Scottish Government needs to work with the UK Government to get us through this, not least of all because we not only have to come out of COVID crisis in one piece, we are Brexiting in December. And that means another challenge, whether you like it or don't like it, and we all have different opinions in this chamber, we need to be united in how we deal with it. Because if we're not, we may feel politically virtuous, but the people will not thank us, because it's the real everyday lives that we are going to devastate if we don't do all of this well. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to pick up on the remarks from Michelle Ballantyne, because I think, to be honest, she's making a point that will resonate with a lot of our constituents. People are genuinely anxious. They're worried. They will watch the First Minister's briefing. They will see the welcome fall in the number of people who are infected and who are dying of coronavirus. And they will be feeling the mounting anxiety as to their future economic prospects. Will they have a job to go back to in the autumn? Will they be able to pay the mortgage? What about their children going back to school? What opportunities will they have? The small business owner. And I declare an interest as a member of the Musicians' Union and someone who is in music. I know the anxiety being felt by so many across the music sector right now. And I'll declare another interest. My wife works in television, and I've sensed the anxiety among so many people who are freelance. So I recognise that. I don't agree with everything that Michelle Ballantyne said, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I do recognise that, and I think it is so important that we do not lose sight of the economic anxiety that this crisis is causing. But what we have to remember first and foremost is this is a public health crisis. There cannot be any economic recovery without a health recovery. That is just the reality of it, both in the practicalities of being able to maintain a functioning NHS and to be able to ensure that we see a return of consumer confidence. So it's paramount that our efforts and our focus has to be on ensuring that we suppress this virus. And I think as much as it can be tempting to clutch at straws and hope, magic formulas, maybe 1 metre can achieve an economic reopening that 2 metres can't, I think it's dangerous. I think we have a duty, all of us here, to be consistent in our messaging, because I think there is a clear path out of lockdown, but for that to take place, we must suppress the virus. And my genuine fear is if we are premature, if we have a reckless rush out of lockdown, it will just prove to be a false economy. We will be right back to square one. So we have to have that strategic view, that long-term approach to make sure that a recovery is sustainable. And I think I would just encourage members in their communications with constituents and the press releases they put out to reiterate that point. Let's not risk having division amongst all of us as politicians and our political parties over a false dichotomy between health and the economy, because without addressing the health emergency, we cannot address the economic emergency that comes. Now, there's a few points I want to pick up. Certainly.
Michelle Ballantyne.
I don't disagree with where you're basically coming from, but there is a bigger issue at stake here. COVID is one health issue. We now have hundreds of thousands of cancelled appointments in the health vicinity where people are starting to suffer, I mean really suffer, and people are starting to die. We know that suicides are going up. COVID is one health crisis, but we have coming down the road a huge health crisis as a result of the decisions we've made to try and suppress COVID. Do you recognise that?
Tom Arthur.
I absolutely recognise that is inherent in the government's decision-making framework, which is trying to balance those harms. But one of the things we have to bear in mind is we do not have a full understanding of this virus. We are learning more about it, and we are learning of the longer-term morbidities that are associated now with coronavirus. And I think it would be premature to assume that we have a grasp and a full understanding of the longer-term consequences. Now, I do want to pick up on a few points that were released. I want to welcome from the Cabinet Secretary the support for going back to work. And there's one particular area I wish to raise specifically with the Cabinet Secretary, and I don't expect her to intervene or necessarily respond in her closing remarks, but I hope it's something she will take into consideration. Last week we marked Carers Week, very differently from how we normally mark Carers Week. It was all about making carers visible. Now, a scheme I've been seeking to champion and promote in this chamber for the last few years now is a Carer Positive scheme. The necessary acceleration of the adoption of home working and digital platforms and remote working procedures has been challenging for some, but it's also created new opportunities. And I think clearly there will be reflections about presenteeism, the need for office space when we do return to some normality. But these platforms have given an opportunity for carers to get a better work-life balance. And we know carers have been, to some extent, the unsung heroes throughout this pandemic. And I would ask Cabinet Secretary, when we consider funding and support for businesses to transition, we make sure we provide funding and support for businesses who require it to ensure that these technological gains that we have through digitisation that we've accrued over the course of this crisis, we can apply that to supporting working carers to give them the confidence that they can remain in employment and work from home and work at the office. So I think there's an opportunity to enhance the Carer Positive scheme through this, and I ask the Cabinet Secretary to reflect on that. The other area I have to stress as well is the need for support for the music sector. I know I'm like a broken record on this matter, and I come to the Chamber constantly, but it is so important. The ecosystem is fragile, and there has to be support. Now, I appreciate the Scottish Government is operating within very tight fiscal constraints, and I don't want to get into a constitutional argy-bargy about the fiscal framework. I hope we can find consensus. Now, Donald Cameron said that the UK was Scotland's insurance policy. The reality is the Bank of England has been the UK's insurance policy throughout this printing money. I think we need to be realistic about the level of debt that's been accrued, but I think we also have to be realistic about how it's paid back. We cannot have an austerity 2.0. That has to be out of the question. You have to find consensus in that. The debt that has been accrued over the past 13 weeks, this has to be treated in the way debt's treated after a war and paid over a long duration. Because the danger is, if we do not address the recovery in a way that's equitable and fair and sustainable, we risk what has become a health crisis becoming an economic crisis, becoming a political crisis. And there I will conclude, Presiding Officer.
Now move to the closing speeches, and I call Willie Rennie for a tight 6 minutes, please.
It took to the end of this debate to have quite a fascinating mini-debate between Tom Arthur and Michelle Ballantyne. I think actually it was quite mature and respectful towards each other for what I thought were really important points put by both. I mean, Michelle Ballantyne was right about moving faster and easing because of the other harms that exist as a result of the lockdown. But I think Michelle Ballantyne, failed to recognise three important factors that I think should lead us to take a more cautious approach. That customers cannot be forced into the shops. They need to feel safe. And if they need to feel safe, that will build consumer confidence and that will improve the economy. So we need to deal with the health crisis, and that's where Tom Arthur was right. We cannot force people back to work for exactly the same reasons. They need to feel safe there too. That's why they need to have confidence that the authorities are taking the right decisions. And the third thing is that the CBI have pointed out, quite rightly, that a second peak would be a hammer blow to the economy. it would absolutely obliterate consumer confidence, and that would damage the economy. But nevertheless, I thought Michelle Ballantyne put across the points quite forcibly, and our points are quite valid, certainly.
Michelle Ballantyne. Can I ask, do you recognise that many businesses, the customers, and it's not shops? Most businesses are not necessarily supplying shops. So that's the first point. The second point is, do you also recognise, if you're out on the roads at the moment, a lot of people have gone back to work, that actually lockdown is unravelling on its own, and I think that is a problem, and that actually we need to be instructing people to manage it more effectively.
Willie Rennie.
I mean, we do need to manage it effectively, and I do recognise the economy is wider, but public confidence in the whole needs to be lifted, or it will just falter. And that's why we need to take this step by step and recognise and build confidence as we progress. And I think that would be the right approach to take. But nevertheless, I think there were valid points certainly to make. A feature of economy and finance debates for some years in this Parliament has been the contributions of John Mason. Always frank, often uncomfortable sometimes for his colleagues on the benches, but today particularly honest about his current frugal lifestyle and his membership of ICAS. But his contributions are always thoughtful, and I think we should all be grateful for those contributions as a result of that. Stuart McMillan was right in his contribution when he said that this is not the time to debate independence. And there was, I think, a tension in this debate, and it wasn't between those who support independence or not. It was between those who were trying to raise up their eyes to the challenges that are ahead of us. The new ideas, I think, are required to deal with this crisis and get us through the other side. Angela Constance and Alex Rowley in particular rose to that challenge. Not to go back to where we were, Alex Rowley said. A plea to utilise the yards that we have on the Forth and other parts of Scotland as well. Angela Constance drawn inspiration from Preston and issues around about borrowing powers and also procurement. Tom Arthur at the end of them, praise him endlessly today, Tom Arthur at the end of his contribution talking about technology round about carers and work. And despite some disappointing extracts from his contribution, Kenny Gibson did come forward with some suggestions on taxing global operations so that they pay their fair share towards our economy as we head through this crisis. Now, we as Liberal Democrats are prepared to lend our support to the government's negotiations with the Treasury on flexibilities. A fiscal framework exists in every country set up in a federal way. It covers the resource transfers between tiers of government. I think it is reasonable for it to be looked at in detail when a once-in-a-lifetime global challenge comes to visit us, as no agreement between governments can foresee every eventuality or possible major event. But in the same fashion that the Scottish Government seeks a positive relationship with the UK Government, the same must apply to that relationship with local government. I understand the technical explanation from the Finance Secretary about the cheques that were sought from councils before the allocation of £155 million. Who couldn't understand that? But I do hope she understands how irritated and angry council leaders were with the pause that brought uncertainty and doubt as to whether the Scottish Government could really be relied on to stand by them when they needed the help. Like everyone else, I think they did what they required. I was immensely impressed, particularly in Fife, by the real approach by the officers to make things work, to get the money out the door to the businesses that needed support. They took decisions at that point because they knew they had, or they thought they had, the government behind them. But that hesitation decimated that trust in the government. And I hope the Finance Secretary understands that. This is not a political point. This is a point about trying to build trust between different tiers of government. And I think an awful lot of political capital was lost at that point. And Sarah Boyack talked about the return to schooling in August, and I thought she made some particularly powerful points. But I was disappointed with John Swinney's comments at the weekend when he said councils had enough money to deal with this challenge ahead of us. He said he listed off the money that's already been spent on business support and money to provide food parcels and other support as well. and then cited childcare too, when that money had already been spent. So I was disappointed in that response, and I do hope we can move towards a more mature relationship, because that way, together, we can get through this crisis. Thank you.
Can I remind all groups and the respective members at this point that those who took part in the debate should always be in the chamber for the closing speeches. And we move on, please, to Andy Whiteman. A tight 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. This has been a useful debate, I think. A number of useful points have been raised, but the debate is called Fiscal Implications of COVID-19, and I think what COVID-19 has revealed is the weakness in the fiscal dimensions of devolutions. Reforms over the past 20 years have tended to be ad hoc, they're not coordinated, and we haven't had any substantial reform of the UK's constitution in that regard. Now, I'm pleased that our budget negotiations in past years have succeeded in securing a commitment to developing a fiscal framework for local government, so that a rules-based system is in place, similar to the UK-Scotland fiscal framework. And we can debate the nature and the structure and operation of any fiscal framework, but it's important that it exists in the first place. So I welcomed, Willie Rennie's observation that the Scottish Government cannot argue for greater flexibility going forward in terms of the fiscal framework, whilst at the same time telling councils that there's no more money. That is not a sustainable position. If we're going to have a new fiscal settlement, it needs to cover local government, Scottish Government and UK Government. Now, of course, the fiscal framework, as many have pointed out, I'm afraid I'm very, very pressed for time. I do apologise. The fiscal framework is not designed for handling a pandemic. And we're facing a situation where obviously public revenues are declining due to tax reliefs, payment holidays, reduced income, tax yields, etc., whilst the costs to the state and healthcare, business support, wages, social security, etc., are rising. Debt too is rising, but as Patrick Harvey pointed out, the capacity to repay this debt, the ratio of public sector debt interest to public revenues, is at historic low. Now, of course, that will only be sustainable so long as we have low interest rates and low inflation. Now, earlier this year, this Parliament approved a budget already in circumstances of great uncertainty, a lateness of the UK budget, Brexit, and adjustments to forecast revenues. Now to add, COVID-19 does present real challenges, not just in the short term, but I think also in the long term. And for Scotland, of course, tax revenues are forecast are now meaningless. We will have less income tax, less land and buildings transaction tax, less non-domestic rates, and we have more costs as well. Presiding Officer, the UK Government has responded to this by increased borrowing. And it's notable that these are powers not available to Scotland, and not available simply because we do not have a central bank. And I welcome Kate Forbes' reference to remarks made by the former Chancellor Alistair Darling. Now, previous debates on the economy have highlighted the role of the Bank of England in creating new money, so-called quantitative easing. And in fact, since 2009, £445 billion has been magicked out of thin air. Now, Patrick Harvey was right to criticise the credit card analogy of Donald Cameron. I have a credit card, but I can't print any money. I'm not a central bank. I can't issue bonds. But quantitative easing has, according to the Bank of England's own analysis, enriched the richest 10% of the population by more than all the other 9 deciles put together. And the Bank of England's £200 billion of quantitative easing to respond to COVID-19 will increase this inequality. Now, obviously, it provides flexibility to the UK government, as the interest due on this debt is now no longer due to private sector, but to a central bank that it owns. And I think there's 2 consequences of this, 2 issues, arguments arise. First of all, as I argued recently in an economy debate, the Scottish Government should have access to this share of the magic money tree, some £20 billion, to be allocated according to principles designed by the Scottish Government. Not necessarily just buying gilts in the private market, but more fundamentally, in buying gilts from the private sector is not the best way of stimulating the economy because of the inequality. And there is a sound argument made by many economists for directing much of this £3,000 per head direct to households. If it were all allocated directly to households, someone earning £100,000 would receive a 3% of their gross income. Someone earning an average of 24k, £12,000 would receive a 12.5 boost to their income. Now, this is an example of what the Chancellor Rishi Sunak argued recently needs to be, and I quote, time to be bold and a time for courage. I just want to briefly turn to some of the contributions from members. I thought Jackie Baillie was correct in arguing for an extension to the job retention scheme beyond October, and also on the point of a time to pay debts. I thought that was very telling as well. Willie Rennie was right to raise the question of local government, as others did. But in arguing that the government's motion didn't include UK interventions, as if there were some kind of external subvention, I think is a little bit misplaced. They're financed by debt, but this debt will be repaid by Scottish payers, just as it will be paid by taxpayers from other parts of the UK. It's not aid in any way. And I think Maurice Golden was guilty of failing to recognise this fact and failing to answer Kate Forbes' legitimate challenge about where the money was coming from, because we will be paying this just as much as all other taxpayers in the UK. Angela Constance raised a very important point about the steps that be taken as highlighted in the Commonwealth's Economic Resilience Report, which I was very impressed with. John Mason talked about tax reform. And I agree, the poorest 20% still pay more as a percentage of their income in tax than the richest 20%. And we need a shift from flat taxes like VAT to progressive taxes like income. But more importantly, we need a shift from taxes on earned incomes to taxes on accumulated wealth and assets, because there's clear evidence from studies done by the IPPR and others that those who own assets, landlords, shareholders and others, have seen their income substantially protected, whilst those depending on earnings and high fixed costs in housing, etc., have got much worse. Presiding Officer, members have extolled the virtues of the UK government, which, yes, has provided significant short-term stability, but the real question is, what are we going to do in the future? And I think that that poses real challenges to all of us if devolution indeed is to be sustainable. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Now call Rhoda Grant for absolutely no more than 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I feared as this debate started that it was going to be an argument about which government had done more. But actually there were very many thoughtful contributions, and I'm glad of that. Because the truth is, we're not through the pandemic. And the required response that we are making now will need to be continued into the future. We'll need a lot more intervention to recover from what we've been through. And both governments need to continue to intervene. And Alec Riley pointed out that the economy had been in a bad place before the pandemic, and that makes it even worse, recovering from it. But we must always remember that this is about people, it's about their future. And sometimes it's about their very survival, and we represent them here, and we must do that while we frame the way forward. Much of the debate was about the fiscal framework, and I think it's very clear that it's not fit for purpose. It was never fit for purpose, and I don't understand why the Scottish Government signed up to it in the first place, and it needs to be changed at the time of the review. Even Donald Cameron talked about the £1 billion black hole, and that happened before COVID-19. So we need to look at flexibility now, and Jackie Baillie suggested that one form of flexibility could be more time to pay back that £1 billion, but I fear we may need more than that as well, because borrowing and reserves are not enough, I don't think, to meet the level of intervention that our communities need. And that flexibility can only be gained by goodwill from both of our governments. They need to negotiate that and find a way forward, and we, in our amendment, urge them to do so. Alec Riley and Sarah Boyack talked about the government's role in the economy, about what they could do, about renewable jobs, which are going elsewhere while our yards sit empty, about community heat networks, and indeed all the work that we could be doing, retrofitting, for example, to meet our climate change obligations. We want a job guarantee scheme that pays people, and those people could be paid to do that work that is desperately needed. We need an industrial strategy to manage the kind of economy we want. And Bruce Crawford was quite right, pointing out that we have a disproportional dependence on things like tourism. We must be clear that that doesn't happen going forward. The best way of getting revenues to pay for our response is to make sure that people are working and that people are paying taxes. So yes, it's good to see converts to the windfall tax and the social responsibility levy, but we must make sure that people are working in order that that taxes are paid, and we must work to make sure that happens using all the levers that government have at their disposal. A number of speakers talked about local government, and they're really in the front line of delivery, and they need to get the consequentials that came to government, because they've already spent an additional £145 million, which Sarah Boya pointed out. And often when I'm speaking to councils, it's not only money they're waiting for, but they're also waiting for advice and guidance on how they proceed. And with education, this is even more stark. They need the advice how they're going to reopen schools, because there is a cost attached to social distancing. And let me be clear, I'm not suggesting for one moment that we don't meet that cost, because as Tom Arthur said, what is most important to the economy is that we suppress this virus. So changing distances required between pupils without scientific proof that that's what's required would actually cause huge problems in our schools. We need more teachers, therefore. We need more classrooms. We need to reopen buildings. We maybe need to use halls, community halls, church halls and the like. We need more buses to transport children to school. We can't simply say they can go to school a day a week. That's not good enough, because already we're seeing the attainment gap widening with every day that passes. Because some children are receiving no education at all. They're from families who can't afford iPads. They can't afford broadband to give their children access, even if they had iPads to access education. And also, those who can afford it are going to invest in tutors, and who wouldn't, to bring their children, to enhance their children's life chances. But that again means that the attainment gap grows and grows. And parents also need to know when their children are going to go to school. They need to know that, because they need to go to work if we're going to reopen workplaces and have enough money in our economy that shops are required. And it's not just about school education. It's also about nursery education. Parents need to know what advice is given, because they need to know that primarily that their children are going to be safe. So we simply need to build on those requirements to give people the confidence to go back to school and work. And we simply can't go back either to the economic norms of austerity. And if this pandemic has shown us one thing, it has shown us this, that austerity was a political choice, and one that must never be revisited. Our economy can't be rebuilt on the low pay of our key workers, people that we must reward not just with esteem, but also financially. And we must invest in our future, and in doing so create a country worthy of their efforts, because they bore the brunt of this pandemic.
Call Alexander Burnett for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I note members to my register of interests. Firstly, I'd like to join my colleagues and members across the Chamber who have welcomed the additional funding made available to date by the UK Government. And I know that I'm not alone when I say that for the past 3 months have consisted of thousands of emails from constituents detailing their desperation for support to feed their families, to pay their mortgages or their energy bills, or the many businesses, small and large, who wanted to do all they could to avoid making staff redundant and ensuring they would have a livelihood at the end of this. As my colleague Donald Cameron has said, due to the support from the UK Government, we have had over £10 billion in extra spending to save livelihoods and bolster public services. And this has meant we've seen the protection of 800,000 Scottish jobs, thanks to their unprecedented economic interventions. But it's disappointing that in a return to form, the SNP government have started to play party politics once again. And to be honest, I find it rather bold of them, with such brazen hypocrisy, to call on central government for more funding, while simultaneously rejecting the same request to them from local government. Because, as my colleague Graham Simpson mentioned, the SNP are forcing local authorities across Scotland to raid their reserves in order to support their communities through this crisis. Yeah, certainly.
Kate Forbes.
Could the member please advise the Chamber where the Scottish Government can get additional resources in order to fund any additional asks that he makes? I'm specifically talking about revenue.
Alexander Burnett.
I think there are plenty of projects which have not been able to go ahead for a number of reasons, and there are plenty of powers. If that is the case, then why is it then that COSLA have become so fed up with the SNP that it is now seeking support directly from the UK government? But it's not just our councils that the SNP are letting down, because right now our high street shops are being failed by this current government. So I'm pleased to say that the Scottish Conservatives are currently calling for support to these businesses. And we're asking the Scottish Government to consider various measures, such as law changes relaxing rules on pavement eating and drinking, temporary scrapping of parking charges to encourage shoppers to come out, and a review of a 2-metre rule in social distancing. And this will not only bolster local businesses, but stop closures and bankruptcies in towns right across the country. Now, I know that the Scottish Government have taken many unprecedented steps in order to assist our constituents during this crisis. However, I cannot help but feel anger that this SNP government did not better prepare for such a situation as this. And yes, we may not have known that a pandemic of this magnitude could occur, but for 12 years, the SNP have not listened to us, whilst we've warned them of draining reserves and not doing enough to boost our economy. And so we entered this crisis with a weakened economy and not enough left for a rainy day. And now it's pouring. And this is echoed by businesses and academics alike. Professor Jim Gallagher at the Finance Committee a fortnight ago said, and I quote, he said, "In the past 10 years, we have done less well in promoting economic growth than the rest of the UK has." And that contrasts with every decade before then, from the 1960s onwards. And he went on noting that at the time of devolution in 1999, Scotland was the 3rd richest region of the United Kingdom. Since about 2008 or so, per capita economic growth in Scotland has consistently underperformed that of the UK. And in the decades before that, it had consistently outperformed that of the UK. His words, not mine. Well, there's only been one constant in that period of poor performance, and that's this SNP government. And nothing strikes fear into business more than Kate Forbes saying that the SNP will use their ingenuity to solve this crisis. So what's the SNP's reaction been to this pandemic? What is this ingenuity? Demands for more borrowing powers and full fiscal autonomy? Except that does not solve the problem, it will only make it worse. For their reckless plans for full fiscal autonomy would slash the Scottish budget and leave more Scots struggling to make ends meet during this economic crisis. As my colleague Maurice Golden noted, the reality is that full fiscal autonomy will lead to cuts, seeing every person in Scotland £2,000 poorer, as we would lose the additional funding from the UK. So in the middle of this crisis, this is the last thing any of our constituents need. So instead of picking constitutional fights or arguing over full fiscal autonomy, the SNP governments need to focus on the task ahead. So sort out Scotland's test and trace system, which is vital to getting our economy moving again, and sort out our education system, which is vital to our children's future. Thank you.
Now call... excuse me, please. Thank you very much. Now call Kate Forbes to close this debate. If you take us up to 5:30, please, that's about 6 minutes.
Sure, thanks very much, Presiding Officer. This debate matters because we are living through an extremely challenging time. Combating coronavirus required investment and support to the NHS, our frontline workers and our care homes. And the next chapter cannot be dressed up. It will be challenging, but we are determined to get through it. We've debated in the past the choices that we face at this point in our history to build a fairer society, to position our economy for sustainable growth and to embrace the opportunities in the midst of one of the greatest challenges of our time. And many members have made that point, providing ideas as to how we do that. But, Presiding Officer, these are all, in highlighting the many challenges we face, we know that we take our responsibilities seriously. We're committed to using all of our resources, all of our efforts and all of our creativity to invest in communities, to support the economy and to protect public services. And that's why today's £230 million capital stimulus is so important. Investment in high-growth companies, investment in construction projects, in regeneration, in transport and in digitalisation. And that will be just the first phase of our economic response. Larger programmes will follow as we prepare a fuller response to aid long-term recovery from the economic and social harm caused by the pandemic. And that is to restore the very economic confidence that Willie Rennie mentioned, based on managing the health crisis. And as we do so, I will keep listening to the many ideas that have been raised from Angela Constance, Alex Rowley, John Mason and others in how we navigate these choppy waters. But, Presiding Officer, we will be making those decisions and taking those actions with one hand tied behind our backs, unless there is change. And Michelle Ballantyne's speech perhaps made the point better than I will in telling the Chamber that the funding figures aren't guaranteed. The funding figures from the UK Government aren't guaranteed until the end of this financial year. That end is far too long to wait during a crisis. Willie Rennie asked for the type of powers and flexibilities we are seeking, and some of those include protection against negative consequentials. It also includes, Alex Burnett will be interested to hear, the ability to use capital underspend to meet our revenue needs. I'm sure Alex Burnett knows full well the difference between capital and revenue. He perhaps doesn't know that right now we cannot use any capital underspend from those projects to meet the revenue shortfalls. Local government needs revenue, businesses need revenue, the NHS needs revenue, not capital, and that is one of the flexibilities we need. There are other flexibilities that we have talked about in terms of using our borrowing powers for the reasons that we actually need them, such as responding to a pandemic, greater flexibility to carry over our capital budget from the Scotland Reserve, and the ability to manage reconciliations over a longer period of time. Presiding Officer, I want to address the remarkable argument that's been deployed in the Chamber this afternoon by the Tories that borrowing is bad at a time when the UK Government is forecast to increase its borrowing by £300 billion. That is how they have funded the very welcome interventions in our economy. That's what has bankrolled the furlough scheme and the self-employed scheme. They are welcome, but we cannot dress this up as though the UK Government has reprioritised its own budget in order to make those funding choices, and therefore asking the Scottish Government to reprioritise our budgets, potentially jeopardising key frontline interventions in the process, is hypocrisy. And I think the point that was well made, in fact, by Graham Simpson sums it all up. His speech illustrated the core issue. He asked, as is his right, for more funding for local government. He can ask for that, as he can ask for more funding for anything. But he told me not, I've got 1 minute and 1.5 minutes, but he told me not to raise taxes for it, and that's fair enough. That is his right to make that argument. But perhaps he could tell me what other source of funding we have in order to meet those funding requests, because the only other source that this government has, whether we like it or not, is the UK Government, because we are denied any powers to borrow for a pandemic. So yes, I will work with local government to make the case to the UK Government for additional funding and indeed flexibilities for local government. And I think that point illustrates the core issue that we have been debating today. There have been various points made about the fiscal framework. Some have talked about the fact we should use our full borrowing powers before we go looking for more. I would remind them that we do not have borrowing powers for a pandemic. Jackie Baillie said we were protected by a symmetrical shock, but that we should take responsibility for an asymmetrical shock because of our own political decisions. But as David Phillips of the IFS said at Finance Committee, he said that the higher reliance on hospitality and associated industries could mean that there is a greater impact on Scotland irrespective of political decisions. And the Scottish Government has 100% of the risk at the margin for changes in its relative revenue performance or changes in its relative welfare performance. That is all borne by the Scottish Government. And that is quite unusual, he said, internationally, and it might, he said, be worth considering whether it is appropriate. And certainly my view this afternoon, Presiding Officer, is that it's not appropriate. And as we hopefully come to a vote now, I can assure the Parliament that if all parties support the call for greater powers and flexibilities, then I will continue in good faith, with goodwill, to negotiate. It will take both parties to engage, but I am fully committed to making it happen in order to ensure that we're investing in our economy and ultimately rejecting austerity.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on the fiscal implications of COVID-19. The next item of business is consideration of legislative consent motion 22034 on corporate insolvency and governance bill. Could I call on Jamie Hepburn to move this motion?
Moved, President Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. We turn now to decision time. There are 6 questions today. The first question is that Amendment 22033.1 in the name of Donald Cameron, which seeks to amend motion 22033 in the name of Kate Forbes on fiscal implications of COVID-19 be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. I'll read the result of the vote, then I'll take a point of order from Mr Green. The result of the vote on Amendment 22033.1 in the name of Donald Cameron is yes 18, no 55. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Point of order from Jamie Green. I take it your vote was not recognised?
It's just to check if it was registered. It's not appearing on the screen, but I see the microphone is working. I'll check the official record afterwards, but if there are future votes, I won't be able to participate, such as the joy of technologies in this place.
Right. Thank you, Mr Green. I will we'll be able to check, and if not, it'll be noted on the record that you have voted. In this case, can I confirm that you voted with the Conservatives for the amendment? Yes. Thank you. That is confirmed. Now, the next question is an amendment in the name of Jackie Bailey. I would remind members that if the amendment is agreed, then the amendment in the name of Willie Rennie will fall. So the question is that Amendment 22033.2 in the name of Jackie Bailey, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Kate Forbes, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote, and members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on Amendment 22033.2 in the name of Jackie Bailey is yes 55, no 18. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that Amendment 22033.3 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Kate Forbes, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may vote now. The result of the vote on Amendment 22033.3 in the name of Patrick Harvey is yes 53, no 18. There were no abstentions. The motion is therefore agreed. The amendment in the name of Willie Rennie is preempted. So the next question is that motion 22033 in the name of Kate Forbes as amended on fiscal implications of COVID-19 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 22033 in the name of Kate Forbes as amended is yes 55, no 18. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. And the final question today is that motion 22034 in the name of Fiona Hislop on legislative consent motion corporate insolvency and governance bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. Thank you very much. I close this meeting.